Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel, and to another PC build. Without wasting too much time, for this video, I'll be going over the build process, how I got the parts, and what you can do to replicate a build that is similar, yet costs around the same amount of money, without deviating from the core foundations. Considering Prime Day is happening and other sites are trying to compete, all this results in decent sales on components, so perhaps this is a good time to consider upgrading or perhaps even building your first system if you've been looking to get into PC gaming. The context of this build is that a very good friend of mine recently reached out to me and wanted to upgrade his system, specifically to build a mid-tier system to last him at least half a decade and put him on an easily upgradable platform alongside having more storage. The budget allocated was around $1,100. At first, I told him that he was looking at a monumental bill, considering the shortages, price hikes, and, well, general state of the industry. I personally didn't think it was necessary, considering he already had an i5 11600K base system, he only played in 1080p, and the only thing really holding him back from playing modern games was his GTX 1070, 16 gigs of DDR4 considering he likes to have some stuff open, and a 1TB SATA SSD as his only storage. In my eyes, all he really had to do was upgrade his 1070 to something like an RTX 3070 or an RX 6700 XT, or even an Intel Arc B580, slot in a lightly used NVMe, and then find another 16 gigs of DDR4 locally for around like $50 to $60, for a total cost of around $300 to $350 USD. For someone that dabbled in pretty much every genre of game, like shooters such as the latest COD or Team Fortress 2, to rhythm games like Deadest Disco, or even MOBAs like Awesome Nuts, it should have been fine. But he insisted, as the previous build was going to be utilized for something else, and frankly, it's their money to spend, and I'm not one to refuse being able to work with parts that I normally wouldn't be able to touch otherwise. The build that fit the bill was something AM5, at least 32 gigs of RAM, and having a GPU with a decent amount of VRAM that could do both 1080p and 1440p, while not using too much power. The tech-savvy amongst you probably already have the parts narrowed down. Perhaps you can take a guess before I reveal them. However, the one thing I had free reign with, he did not care for aesthetics in the slightest. If it allowed for more budget to put into the components themselves, he absolutely did not care what I did, as long as the core components themselves performed and performed well. If it's one thing I know what to do, it's to squeeze the budget. And to be fair, in his words, the key phrase was, ugly as sin. Although, no unicorn poop. So, if I can't blast it with color, then the next best thing is for me to dig into my stash of random PC components I've accumulated over the years, and take a few of these fans for the ride. We've got some stock height-wise 63-pin fans, a random white fan from a CPU cooler I only used half of, a Chromax fan from Arctua, and perhaps this white RGB fan that I found lying around from Vitro. And of course, who can forget the power supply? We have a 850 watt gold unit from Vitro, ATX 3.1 ready, and of course, the star of the show. And with that, let's get into it. So let's get the boring stuff out of the way first. For storage, I went on to r/hardware swap on Reddit, and I snagged this SK Hynix PC801 Gen 4 2TB NVMe for $170 shipped. Now, these used to be under $100, but those were better times, considering I used to get a 4TB one used for the same price about a year ago. Considering the motherboard doesn't have a heatsink, I just decided to whip out this thing I just had on hand, which is this Corsair NVMe heatsink with thermal pads. You don't see it here until later, but it's not actually silver, it's red, with the same branding that you see on the top. It is pretty ugly as sin. For the CPU cooler, I have this Cooler Master Hyper 212 Halo Black. I got this for about $13 on a really insane flash deal one day, about a month ago, but they're no longer this cheap. I think last I checked they're about $30, which is the standard price, but honestly, the $15 coolers from Thermalright and ID Cooling, they get the job done, especially for a CPU of this caliber. The RAM was yet another deal I found on r/hardware swap on Reddit. The person was selling it for $240 shipped, and that was actually an insane deal considering that it's Trident sticks from G.Skill and they're rated at 6400 megatransfers per second. This is a 32GB kit, which this kit usually goes for about $400 to $500 retail. And for a nice little accessory, I decided to get a contact frame for the AM5 CPU, and this Fexodon Tech AM5 contact frame was only like $5 on Amazon, and it was extremely well packaged and it was well reviewed. I don't know how they managed to price it this low, but considering that it was actually fine and it just looked a little tacky, honestly, considering it's just hidden underneath your CPU cooler anyway, this was a really good deal. Usually you'd pay about maybe $10 for one of these, and holding it in my hand, it was pretty sturdy. I mean, it was just kind of a hefty piece of metal, as they all should be, but for $5, again, that's pretty good considering most other options are much more expensive, or they only have like a tiny little thing you put on the CPU itself rather than screwing it down. And of course, for the heart of the system, we have an AMD AM5 CPU. Now, this is a little bit of a cheat code. I do live about an hour away from a micro center, and this is their 7500 X3D and B850MC bundle, as you can see here. The tag has it where it lists the motherboard and the processor. It is pre-installed on the motherboard socket, so I did ask the staff if I could maybe get an ATX motherboard on it instead, and they said no, because there's a seal on it. So unfortunately, if you want to migrate this CPU over to an ATX board, you'll need to buy one separately. But considering that the CPU itself is already $200 and the combo is, well, $200, you could probably just get the ATX board and then sell off the B850M to make your money back. And here is a full body shot of the motherboard and the CPU here. Decent VRM for at least a cheapo board. It's got Wi-Fi, 4 PCIe slots, 4 RAM slots, and USB-C connection alongside a decent amount of fan headers. And there is a hidden NVMe slot on the back of the motherboard that you don't see until later, but here we are. This is my first time having hands-on with a 7500 X3D. The other time I've had an X3D chip in my hands was a 9800 X3D, which was a CPU I used to build a friend their dream gaming PC back in 2024. Apparently the chip is only like 65 watts or something, so it's actually pretty easily cooled, and that's why I was okay putting the Hyper 212 on it. For the graphics card, it is the ever so trusty AMD Radeon RX 9060 XT 16GB, and this is the ASRock Challenger model, so it was one of the cheaper models even back on release, but a GPU is a GPU, and unless this thing explodes, I don't have an issue with it. Considering it seems like there was no fancy packaging involved or anything, and all the budget went to the graphics card, honestly, I would prefer this model over others that charge you more just because it has a fancy box or something. This particular model of 9060 XT is as bare bone as it gets. We've got 2 fans rather than 3 like the old one that I handled, which was a gigabyte model, and this one has pretty cheaply made fans, and the shroud itself is also plastic, but this doesn't mean that it won't function or anything like that. Like I said, as long as it doesn't explode and it doesn't die within 2 months, it should be fine. You can see here that it only requires 1 PCIe 8-pin to function, and honestly that is insane efficiency for this 1080p/1440p value card. The backplate is just a sort of industrial pattern with the AMD Radeon logo and ASRock on it, and here is the tag for the 9060 XT 16GO instead of GB, whatever it's, I don't know. What I do find interesting is I think most, if not all, 9060 XTs only have 3 display outs, 1 HDMI and 2 DisplayPort. Unless if you're actually trying to do a quadruple monitor setup, this shouldn't be a problem for you. Let's take a look at the power supply in a little bit more detail. This is a Vitro G5, and this is a fully modular ATX 3.1, basically saying that there's an arson connector available, and also in white. I picked this up locally for $55. There's a warehouse that sells A-stock PC components like graphics cards, cases, power supplies, cable extensions, all that. And the first place I headed to look for a power supply was here, because if I were to buy this online, it cost about 1.5 times, if not 2 times the price. The unit itself is perfectly, well, square, I guess, so it doesn't extend out too long like one of those super long EVGA power supplies. It Like I said, it's fully modular, it's got all the connections you could possibly want for a system running 850 watts, including 2 arson ports, which is pretty neato. But we won't be using that anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And the rest of the cables here. For the case, if it wasn't for the fact this thing was just randomly 46 bucks one day, specifically the white version, I would have never bought it. This is the Corsair 3200D, and it literally looks like someone punched in the front of my case. Or, alternatively, it looks like someone just loaded up a revolver and... Memes aside, there is a lot to like about this case. Even though that it actually does not come with a rear fan, the case does come with 2 bottom mount fans. One of them is tilted so that you can actually bring airflow toward your graphics card. You can also see that there is an integrated GPU sag bracket in there. And something I do like in cases that have toolless designs is that they actually have a holding screw where you actually can't accidentally just rip off the side panel or something. I had that gripe with the Fractal Meshify 2. So you gotta unscrew it first, and then you can pop off the side panel. The case comes with your standard accessory box, nothing fancy or anything, it just contains everything you need. Inside has one bag full of everything you need, nothing else inside the box, and it's pretty much just all the screws you would require for the motherboard, your storage devices, the fans that you would want to put on the bottom, and a couple extra standoffs in case if you wanted to mount something different. Like I pointed out before, there are 2 mounts on the bottom for more fans. One of them is angled for graphics card cooling, which is cool. And they do give you the radiator-esque screws where they are skinnier, but they go through the fan and mount with pressure. Flipping the case around, this back panel has an insane groove/rib. I guess it was part of the manufacturing process or it helped with something, I'm not sure, I'm not a Corsair employee, but the screws on it are actually pretty nice. They are highlighted in yellow, which I think these are on other cases as well, and they are captive, so if you unscrew these all the way, they will not fall out, unless if you go out of your way to unscrew them even further. And they are actually part of the power supply shroud as well, which I will go into in a little bit more detail later on how that works. For the bundle of cables on the back side, we have our standard affair. We've got our PWM connector for all the 3 front fans. We've got USB-C, and it is a 20 Gbps cable, which is pretty neato. We have a all-in-one front panel connector, which is always nice to have, considering that not everyone has tiny raccoon-like fingers. And what is odd about this case is that there is no USB 3.0 front header. It's only 2.0, so I guess only mice and stuff in the front, I guess. And last but not least, the audio connector for the front headphone jacks and stuff like that. So looking at the power supply shroud again, we have these 2 captive screws in the back for the power supply. And honestly, I don't hate it. You would probably want to screw in a couple more screws if you really wanted to, but you could totally just screw in these 2 and be fine with it, as you can see here. And if you ever needed to take out the power supply for any sort of reason, you could just do this without a screwdriver, just twist and go. We do have 2 2.5-inch drive mount support in the back, and how it's designed is that you actually screw in the drives backwards so that there is space for the connectors so that they don't actually bend out of whack, which is pretty cool. And if you wanted to mount a 3.5-inch hard drive on the bottom, the little bumps alongside the little guidance stoppage points allow you to do that. I also discovered this random thing I had on my shelf that I didn't even realize I had. This is an infinity mirror reverse blade RGB fan, and you know exactly where this is going. And last but not least, let's take a look at the top of the case. And I found this sort of interesting because you have the standard mounts for the radiators, and then you have this massive hole in the front alongside this extra gap in the back. Maybe it's to help you with cable management or something like that. I'm not too sure. But with all that said, let's get to assembling the system. god. What have I done? Oh god. 1,500 on Facebook Marketplace. I know what I have for a price. We're starting off the benchmark session with Battlefield 6, a rather intensive title, and the game already puts me at high and ultra, so that's rather interesting. We're not going to use any upscaling techniques or any FSR frame gen. We're going to raw dog it and just see how much FPS we get. And loading in, I'm pleasantly surprised. We're at 100 FPS average-ish, and it goes upward of 115, and despite firing and blowing stuff up, we barely drop underneath 100 FPS. I guess my expectations were tempered considering I usually work with budget hardware, but considering my screen is filled with blood, there's explosions, a bunch of effects going on, and me having to do a bunch of animations, I honestly expected to hit maybe 60-ish, but no, we're hitting at around 100 average with only me dipping down below 90 when I died. And considering that the game is running in 1080p, I think with just turning on FSR and putting it at like prioritized graphics quality, it's probably good. I'm happy to say that this is definitely something that can be worked with, and if you wanted to use FSR or anything like that to reach higher refresh rate caps, you can totally do so. Moving up to 1440p, because my friend does intend to upgrade it in the near future, it still puts me at ultra, and we're just going to enable the anti-aliasing for FSR native, and we already are still seeing similar performance. Explosions happening around me, smoke, reload, blood. I'm still sitting around 100-ish FPS, maybe 95 if you want to be more technical. And what's actually pretty interesting to me as well is that the temperatures are really good. The CPU is sitting around 70 degrees, which honestly is fine for an AM5 CPU. And when it comes to the GPU, that's what really surprised me. I guess that fan on the bottom really is doing some work because it is actually not as hot as the CPU. We're sitting at around 64-65 degrees at 100% load. And keep in mind, this is nothing to scoff at. I'm throwing grenades around here, I'm like crawling around and stuff is blowing up around me with a bunch of UI heads-ups and stuff like that. So I'm quite happy with it. This does bode well in regards to the PC's longevity, considering that even without any upscaling whatsoever, we're hitting really good FPS. So if anything is unoptimized, I suppose FSR can take care of that problem. And the option of having to put it to ultra performance is probably off the table. Heading over to a game that I know he plays, which is Call of Duty. When it comes to the quality settings, the game defaulted me to high and ultra, just like Battlefield 6, and the game also gave me the FSR 4 option by default, although it put it on the FSR preset of native. Despite this though, I had high hopes considering the performance in Battlefield 6, and I was not let down. When I loaded into the map, I was already getting around 120 FPS indoors, and when I jumped outside, there wasn't much of a dip, down to like maybe 110 or so. And I apologize for the state of my gameplay here, it looks like I literally just sprayed nothing, but the reason why is because my screen kept flickering on and off, and it was really annoying. Like, you can see how as I'm traveling around, I just had no aim whatsoever. I was shooting quite literally blindly, so I hope you can forgive me. Moving on to 1440p, I decided to change only one setting, and it was just to change the FSR from native to quality. Literally everything else the game gave me beforehand was never changed, so everything else is still on high and ultra. I did notice something odd though, but if you pay attention to the operator's hands, it looks like something straight out of the back rooms, and I'm not sure if that's a constant or not, but the FPS is what I really cared about. And when it came to the performance, I was still pretty happy with it. FPS was in the 90s and 100s, and again, this is at high and ultra settings, so any sane person would be putting it on low and medium, and there was no insane frame time spikes or anything where I was feeling stutters left and right. I was having a good time. and temperatures and usages seem normal as well. We see that the CPU is sitting around the 60-ish percentage usage, and the GPU is pinged at 100%, which is what we want. So I can pretty confidently say that I believe this PC fulfills my friend's needs both for now and into the near future, and perhaps even into the foreseeable future for the next 5 years, which is, what the goal was. Considering the 9060 XT is also capable of ray tracing, and of course has the latest generation of FSR upscaling, this system will probably need a CPU upgrade before a GPU upgrade, if I'm being honest. Another game I wanted to check out on the system was Valve's newest game, Deadlock, since I feel like it's the better game to benchmark performance considering it's probably the most intensive game Valve has on offer that isn't Half-Life Alyx. Because sure, I could benchmark something like Team Fortress 2 or some of the older Valve games, which are games I know my friend plays, but those games literally everyone knows you can run on a PC from like 2015. If you have like an i7 6700 with a GTX 1050 Ti, you can run those games. So I feel like there'd be no point doing so, considering the parts in here are literally 10 years newer. That being said, the game is running quite well on DX11 on essentially maximum settings. I skipped 1080p and jumped straight into 1440p, considering the performance of the previous 2 titles I ran, and I wasn't let down. The game was averaging pretty well around the 150 to 170 FPS mark, and keep in mind, the game automatically set me to high settings too, alongside all the special stuff. Albeit FSR2 was enabled, I kept scaling mode to 1x, so unless if I full blast ultra settings, it's really only up from here. And this game is not CS2 for the first 2 years, so I'm going to chalk this up to another well-optimized Valve title. The last game I want to throw at the system is purely out of my own curiosity, and not because my friend has any interest in playing it, and that game is Zenless Zone Zero. This is mainly due to version 3.0 recently releasing with Scalifer, and because I personally had a really bad experience with the new DX12 Plus ray tracing implementation on my main rig, sporting an i7 13700 and RTX 4070 Ti Super. I also usually don't have a modern AMD GPU on hand, so I figured I'd take the chance and do some testing. Right off the bat, I realized that DX12 wasn't available for AMD GPU owners, at least I couldn't see the option for it. Usually there would be a checkbox before you launch the game asking you if you would like some better graphics, but it straight up wasn't there on the system running all AMD, so for the time being I don't have any access to anything FSR, at least natively. That being said, I still decided to give it the 1440p stress test in the new area and in combat. I found it interesting that when I tried to enable global high precision character resolution, the game literally told me to back the fuck up, and it made its point pretty clear when I walked into the dorms and literally watched people just load in. But even on DX11, the new region seems to be in desperate need of heavy optimization, and I'll be releasing a video on it later this weekend. For performance, I'm getting around the 90 to 100 FPS mark in the overworld, but you can also see the frame time is being pretty inconsistent. My guess is that maybe due to the fact this is my first time loading into the game, there's still some like shader compilation going on in the background or something, and this happens during combat as well. But the FPS averages are still decent, given that the system is probably struggling with this thing more than any other game that we played today, which is both hilarious and pretty tragic. To end off the video, here's a small PCPartPicker comparison of how much I paid for the parts that went into the system, tax approximation factored in, but excluding the special bonuses like the extra fan since those were gifts. You can see here that the parts we chose basically matched the budget of $1,100 perfectly, though I chipped off like $4 around the cooler to round down for my friend, but it's nothing as drastic as saying like making the 9060 XT $200 or anything. Keep in mind that throughout the video, all the prices I've been displaying are approximate US prices. If you're in other countries like Europe or Brazil, for example, these prices probably don't represent your local market / online retail prices, but you probably already knew that. As for the folks in the US, if you live near a micro center, you can probably not only get the same parts deals that I showcased, but chances are something inside your open box aisle is just waiting for you to scoop it up with extra savings, whether it be a power supply, a case, or even a GPU. Who knows? But if not, and you don't want to buy a power spec pre-built, here's a secondary PC part picker list that I picked out with approximate average prices I could find online, and I made sure to match the $1,100 price tag that I paid out. I would also suggest that if AM5 truly just isn't feasible for you, you could possibly go down Intel's LGA 1700 due to their support of DDR4 as an alternative, or perhaps even buying into their current generation of processors. The Ultra 5 250K looks like a mighty fine competitor in the DDR5 space in my opinion, but I do have no idea if Intel's swapping sockets after this, so that is a risk that you run. Otherwise, this is pretty much how to build a PC for around $1,100 in today's really hostile market, really, with a mixture of both used and new parts. I would still say though that it's very much well worth learning how to shop smart on the used market, especially during times like these, because truly if I bought everything new here, we would never be close to the $1,100 price tag. Just make sure that if you do actually buy from like sites, if you don't want to meet with users in person, that you have some sort of buyer protection. Like on eBay, you have buyer protection. On Reddit, for example, you have to use PayPal invoices. So if there actually is an issue, you can dispute it rather than use friends and family, because that's just disallowed. Or perhaps even Amazon, where if you perhaps even buy something off Amazon resale and it's broken, you can return it since their Amazon return policy is just crazy. That'll about wrap it up for this build. And if my friend is watching, I hope he's hyped for getting the system soon.